Hi, I'm Dr. Gwen. I'm a neurotypical psychologist who's been empowering the neurodiverse community for over 20 years. Have you ever wondered what dyslexia is or how to support a dyslexic student more appropriately? Well, in today's episode, I interview Eryn Yolac, founder of Advocate to Educate, in order to learn more about dyslexia and to understand the critical role of early identification and early intervention on emotional well-being. Welcome to the show. I am so excited to welcome Eryn Yolac, founder of Advocate to Educate. Hi, Eryn. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Maybe before we get started in our topic today, I wonder if you could educate the audience about yourself.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm Eryn, and I grew up in Southern California. I myself am dyslexic. I found out I was dyslexic in second grade. I have that memory of making the front office call my dad, who is also dyslexic, to come to school, and I was outside sobbing with my head on his lap, sitting on the bench, and I said, "Dad, I think I'm stupid." And he said, "No, honey, you're just dyslexic, just like me." And I didn't quite understand what that meant then. But now I really realize the significance of that moment. Even as a parent now, for my dad to connect with me and kind of comfort me knowing that he had lived the same experience that I was about to live. So I saw a reading tutor for a very, 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 very long time. And school was tough. I made it. I made it, and I ended up doing the best that I could with a lot of family support. And reading. I don't think I read a full book until maybe my senior year of high school. How I managed to do that, I still don't know. But I was very savvy and used Cliff Notes. I don't even think people use Cliff Notes.
I know. No, I don't think so. You just dated us. Thanks, Eryn.
But I did the best that I could. And then I actually went to photography school for my first bout of college so that I didn't have to read anything. It was, just like you do when you plan for kids for transition. My plan was I'm going to go and be a photographer so I never have to read and write ever again. And then it turns out I wanted to go back and be a special ed teacher. So I had to start all over, go back to a school where reading and writing was, in fact, the method to their madness. We had no multiple choice tests. Everything was essays. And I kind of learned how to be a writer again. But I used the same skills that I used in 8th grade to learn how to write a 5-paragraph essay. I still remember that 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Fergoso. She taught me how to write a 5-paragraph essay. And since then, that is the framework that I used all the way through to get my teaching credential. And so life with dyslexia has its ups and downs, but I feel now I get to, as an advocate and somebody who's very open about my experience, I get to tell other kids that their life's not over and that this is just something that is going to come harder to them. But they get to learn that hard work pays off. And that's an even bigger skill that is so detrimental if kids don't learn that they have to work hard, right? They have to build that muscle. And it's almost as though I explain it like you get 2 for 1. You get to, hopefully, and we can get to that later, but the kids that are getting the proper support and remediation, they get to work hard and learn the importance of grit and the importance of continuing even when it feels like you're going nowhere, because eventually they will learn to to read with the right type of support and the right type of intervention. So I know that was kind of all over the place, but overall, I use it as a strength now, and I use it to give back and share with other parents and kids and relate and let them know it's going to be okay. And that it's okay if you think reading is terrible. Like, that's okay. You don't have to like it. Unfortunately, you have to do it, but it's not the end of the world if you're not the one at the library picking up those books. It's okay. It's okay.
It doesn't have to be part of your identity.
Absolutely.
But this kind of history, though, Eryn, of not only your personal lived experience, which then leads to a choice in college, a degree that doesn't include a lot of reading, and then finding your passion, going back to school, doing special ed for many, many years. You were a special ed teacher for many, many years, and then becoming an ed consultant. Really quickly, for those who don't know what an ed consultant does, I don't know if you could just really quickly let the audience know what an ed consultant is.
Absolutely. So typically we get families coming to us saying, I don't know what to do academically. My child is not thriving. Something's wrong, and we either know exactly what's wrong, but we don't know how to get them what they need, or my child's crying every day on the way to school and I'm having to negotiate with them to go to school, but we don't know what's going on and we need help navigating the educational system. And as a consultant / advocate, I have to help parents understand the entire process and then narrow into how does your specific child learn and what resources do we need to pull in? What additional supports do we need to pull in? And by supports, I mean specifically with kids with dyslexia, we need to look at the way they are taught to read. And right now, there is a California initiative heading towards the right direction. And what that looks like is using the science of reading, which is the research behind the science that shows how kids with dyslexia and even kids without dyslexia will learn to read. It's the scientific approach to reading, right? Unfortunately, we haven't been using the science of reading. And so kids are being taught to read in a way that's called balanced literacy. And essentially what that means is imagine teaching kids how to read with pictures, essentially. So we have a flashcard and it has a picture of a dog on it and the word dog. So kids are associating the whole word dog with the picture. So when they are reading a children's book and there's that picture of the dog, they get to cue in and say, oh, dog. But if you remove the picture and you ask them, what is this word? Most kids with dyslexia, unfortunately, aren't learning what the actual sounds of the words and the sounds of the letters are in order to phonetically read the word dog. And then on top of that, when the child has phonological processing issues, which for the sake of everybody listening, we're going to make it very simple and just call it dyslexia, okay? And I'll go over some areas to look for if you're wondering if you or your child has dyslexia. But essentially, they're not picking up on reading. And so my job is to go in there and figure out, is the instruction the problem? Does the child have dyslexia and therefore the instruction's the problem? Or is there something else going on that we need to uncover and figure out? Maybe there's an auditory processing deficit. So they're actually not processing language and processing sounds in a way that allows them to hear the instruction appropriately to break down words and sounds. So it gets complicated, but overall, I would say a job as a consultant, more so an advocate, is for me to figure out what the child's getting and then look at essentially how that particular child's brain works, and then figure out a way to merge the two. And unfortunately, in schools, I can say in California, we are really behind in identifying this need. And it seems to be kind of the dirty word, like, oh, don't say dyslexia. And especially for everyone listening, you can absolutely say dyslexia. Say it 100 times in your kids' meetings. Do not be afraid. They can write it down in the notes. They don't have to be vague. So dyslexia, dyslexia, dyslexia. And essentially, for those listening, I would say dyslexia, while it does need to be diagnosed, if you or your child struggles with reading, and they're struggling with reading isn't just like reading makes me tired. That's not struggling with reading. If you think back to when you were taught to read, were you trying to save face, for instance? Like, think about your experience, Gwen, as a reader, as a learner, right? Were you the student that was pretending to look for something in their backpack while the teacher was pulling that stick and calling random people's names, and you were looking busy so that you didn't get called on because you'd be mortified if you had to read out loud?
Yeah.
Those are our experiences as a dyslexic individual. Reading out loud is kind of like the number one first sign that we shy away from, because we don't want to be embarrassed in front of our peers when we stumble all over the words. So yeah, I think I answered your question about a consultant and got even deeper than that.
Yeah, no, and because it's your specialty, Eryn, I mean, you're an ed consultant, and I always feel like ed consultants are really great with kind of seeing who the student is, who the child is, and what their learning needs are, and then overlaying it in the bureaucratic system of an IEP or a school setting, where what kinds of modifications or accommodations are going to be necessary to make learning, to allow the student to access the curriculum and to continue to learn. That's really challenging. And I feel like dyslexia, in its own diagnostic category, if you will, is complicated, right? Because not only, very simply, is it, you struggle with reading, but, there's reasons for that. I mean, the visual system, for example, is probably different. There's some different wiring on a visual system, and that's why it's hard to decode those visual symbols, right? Like, or there's auditory processing involved. I mean, there's a lot of layers to having a difficult time with reading. So yeah. I appreciate that you went into like the depths a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I say reading, and I fault myself, a lot of times I put everything into one category. When I say reading, most of the time I mean reading, spelling, and writing.
Yeah.
Collectively. And you mentioned it's complicated, and there are some individuals where their memory is so great that they've been able to memorize the words so that when they see them on the page, they can read them. And so sometimes their dyslexia is hidden because they actually, in kindergarten, first and second, their reading is okay. Their writing is very phonetic, but while that's okay for a little bit, it never, until they learn the rules behind why words are spelled certain ways, unfortunately, at that point, they've learned some bad habits. And so we have to go back and say, oh, we know you can read the word, but can you do that in reverse? Can you spell the word? And then that's where a lot of times you're getting kids in third grade getting diagnosed with dyslexia, because it's not until the writing demand increases that it becomes apparent. And then also, MRI studies have shown that the dyslexic brain fires in different places than an individual who's not dyslexic. Not that we're going to all go out and get MRIs and get these special studies, but my brain is working, a different part of my brain is working. So it's not that natural occurrence like reading is described, essentially. People that are fluent readers, it's not taxing. It's not draining. For us, it is really tiring. And it's almost, it's like running a triathlon. It's very draining. That's all I can say. And so a student in elementary school who's dyslexic tends to be a lot more tired at the end of the day and kind of taps out because it just takes so much effort. So it's important
Yeah.
for us to watch all of it. And then I didn't mention the emotional side that I'm a really big advocate for. Growing up, I had a stigma about myself that I was stupid. Like I shared that with my dad. I decided that I was stupid in second grade. And, of course, our parents help us the best that they can. And, no, not blaming them at all, but you start to take on this persona that you're not good at school. And I was strong in math. That was an area that for me, math was a strength. That's not always the case with everybody, but it was. So I was able to balance, well, I'm good at math, but I am terrible at anything based on reading, writing, and spelling. So I lived that experience all through high school, all through college, and even the second time around when I got my teaching credential. I remember there was a reading and writing lab at, I went to Antioch University, and I went to the the writing, I guess, tutor, you could say, and I would tell all my teachers. That was I was this advocate that said, I'm dyslexic. I'm going to need extra time. I actually didn't have a 504 or an IEP. That's for another video. But that being said, I got taught very young to go and talk to my teachers. And
Yes.
being a Leo, I guess I didn't really have a problem doing that. But I remember saying in college, writing is not a strength and I really need help. And I used the help. I went and they helped me in college to the point where I became much more fluent. But since then, since I haven't been practicing, I can say my writing gets a little rough around the edges, you could say. So deciding I'm dumb affects all different areas of my life. And so it affects my self-esteem, did affect my self-esteem. And it really wasn't until I started giving back to other parents and other kids that I was able to heal my own trauma from the experience. But I think a big part of the emotional the emotional trauma that kids experience when they are not identified early and they are kind of living this life of knowing something's wrong. I'm not reading like my peers. I'm terrified and embarrassed, and all of those things where we're constantly comparing, because unfortunately the classroom is kind of a cesspool for comparing. As much as teachers want to claim, oh, we don't do that. When you are dyslexic, you are comparing. It's just kind of what happens. So when kids don't know what's going on and their parents don't know what's going on, and they just are kind of getting the same balanced literacy, which isn't explicit step by step by step reading instruction, and the teacher tends to move on way before they have mastered the skill, because they have to, because they have their standards to meet and all of that. But our kiddos need explicit step by step phonics. We can get into that more, but when they don't get that and their peers just keep growing and growing and they don't, that's very traumatizing. And I would say half of the families come to me and say, well, the school said we could give them, some extra intervention. And my next question is, what about emotional support? What about counseling? How does your child feel about school? And 9 times out of 10, it's very rare that a parent says, oh, they think they're a great student. That is not what happens. It's they hate school. They're very embarrassed of their work. They are behaviorally becoming a problem because they're trying to hide. And so they'd rather look like the class clown than a bad reader or a poor speller, right? So the trauma seems to be ignored, and they don't think, oh, we should really give this child some real therapy. They can go talk to the counselor, and check in when they're down. No, that is not what I'm talking about. And essentially, my big mission in life is to merge early intervention for dyslexia. We have early intervention for autism, and that's everywhere. We have insurance companies backing us. We have, all the ABA agencies getting access to come into school and do ABA when the school doesn't have their own ABA providers for autism. But unfortunately for dyslexia, insurance companies don't cover a speech and language pathologist to do early reading intervention, which speech and language pathologists also have the ability to teach phonemic awareness and these skills that are underlying the intervention that they'll need later. But I want to merge early intervention for dyslexia with trauma-informed therapy, or a trauma-informed approach to early intervention for dyslexia. I'm working on figuring out how to get this out to the public in a way where we're basically sending the message. And I will use I'll use the experience of my own child to kind of explain this in a nutshell, because it's easier to use a real life example. So my son is also dyslexic. He is 4.5. He's going to be 5 in August. And we knew when he was 2 that he was most likely going to be just like me and just like my dad. It was apparent. Okay, so he was not able to identify letters the way that you could say, neurotypical daughter was, who's 2 years older. His speech was very difficult to understand when he was younger. He did have a pacifier, so we took that away, and that still didn't resolve the issue of unintelligible speech. Everything was backwards. So he would say, or even now, he says, "Pick me up late from school." And I would say, pick you up late? You want to stay after school when everyone is gone? No. Oh, no. No, the other word, or early. Oh, pick me up early. And so he'll say late for early, or no, I don't want to play, when really he means I do want to play. And that sounds pretty stereotypical, right? Like the typical, when people think of dyslexia, it's opposites or letters reversed. But there's more to it. But just in particular for my child, it's those types of language-based issues get in his way. And we started him in speech therapy very, very early to work on sequencing. And what we were able to do is provide him and continue to provide him early intervention for somebody who is most likely going to be dyslexic. Although he's too young to be diagnosed, we know. And just for everybody listening, I want to read you guys some signs at the very young level. So you can start kind of taking inventory to see if these signs could help you determine whether or not your child may need to get screened. So chronic early ear infections are actually a sign of possible dyslexia. a speech delay, stuttering, mixing up sounds and syllables in long words or mispronouncing familiar words, unable to recognize letters even in their own name. So my son's name is 3 letters, and it took him a year, one whole year, to learn how to write his name. And it is still something that he hesitates to write, like on a birthday card. He asks me to do it because he's like nervous he's going to mess it up. Confusing left and right. Another big sign. My child said, I don't know on the sandbox. I want to go on the sandbox and play, but there's not a teacher there to help me put my shoes on the right foot. And I don't know which one goes on which. So of course we put a big happy face on his shoe on the left side. I used a tattoo marker and tattooed a happy face on his foot and on his sock. So he knows all the happy faces go on the foot that has the happy face, and then his other ones has nothing. So he knows the rest goes on there. Trouble rhyming. And nursery rhymes. And then, somebody in the family having dyslexia. Very, very important because it is hereditary. And, not all parents recognize they're dyslexic. So I encourage parents to go and do the research, because just because you weren't diagnosed doesn't mean you're not dyslexic. And it also doesn't mean it's this big deal that you're learning later in life. Obviously, you've probably figured out how to compensate for it, whether that would be going into a profession where you don't really need to be strong in those areas, or maybe you really practiced a lot as a child. So, you never know. So with Leo, I said it. Okay, I guess I didn't know if I should say his name on camera. Whatever. It's okay. So we started him in speech therapy, and then we noticed that he was really struggling with learning how to write his letters. And so what we noticed is that in time and space for dyslexia, you need to teach students, like, where is the top of the letter? Where is the bottom of the letter? And explicitly sit there with him and prompt him over and over again. So he's not just tracing the yellow line. A lot of, in the beginning, his preschool was just giving him things to trace. He was starting all over the place. He had no idea where to start. So it's that explicit step-by-step instruction that he really needs. Now, because we started very early with him, as a parent, knowing that my child is learning differently, now what I'm up against is figuring out how we are going to navigate the public school system. Because if you think about a child who's dyslexic going into kindergarten, they're going to start school, if they're in a public school, with balanced literacy. Balanced literacy is not how my child is going to learn to read. So right out the gate, he's going to start with a curriculum that is not going to be beneficial to his learning. So the question then becomes, do you put him in a specialized school even before he's tried his public school? And then we think about all the associated costs with specialized schools. And so a lot of the clients that come to me have already gone through kindergarten, first, second, sometimes repeating kindergarten, sometimes even repeating second grade. And the child's already traumatized because they've already spent all this time spinning their wheels. And it ends up being then a 2-prong approach. We have to work on, how are we going to get this child to read, write, and spell? And how are we going to work on the emotional trauma that has probably already taken place? And I remember being in an IEP and using the word trauma. And I got a very interesting response. All of a sudden, we happened to have somebody pretty high up in the meeting that was at our IEP, and I described the student's experience as traumatic and that they have already been traumatized. And she interrupts me and says, "What traumatizing event has occurred? I didn't know that there was something similar to rape or, some divorce or some very, what do they call it in this, in the psychological world? It's big T trauma." Right. So they're looking at big T trauma, and I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm merely talking about his experience as a dyslexic individual. And they couldn't seem to bridge the gap. They wanted to minimize the child's experience to say, oh, that can't be real trauma, which is absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. I typically don't talk too much about the pipeline to prison, but if you think about how many people end up in prison that do not have academic skills because nobody identified the fact that they were dyslexic or all of the other things that are out there, right? Had they learned to read, would they really be in the position that they're in? Who knows, right? And so, yeah, the trauma that a child can experience absolutely can lead to bigger trauma. And we have to work on the emotional piece. Absolutely.
Yeah. Eryn, what I love is that you're bringing the emotional piece to the table, and that your lived experiences, or, you referred to big T traumas. In the field, we refer to like little T traumas, right? In other words, they're not the ones that you expect, like natural disasters or big life kinds of changes, but that they're these cumulative little experiences that really paint a cumulative picture. And I think for children, as you were talking about a child masking, not acting or not showing who they truly are, right? Because there's shame, embarrassment involved. What happens over time for little ones is that depression in little ones doesn't look like depression sometimes in adults, but it looks like agitation and irritability, right? It looks like frustration. It looks like withdrawal sometimes. But then we look at, why is a child behaving in this way? And instead of making these kind of flash judgments about the fact that they're misbehaving, it's like, how do we understand their behavior? What is this showing us? Not identifying difficulties early on. And so, you early on had talked about it taking just an inordinate amount of energy to read, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like, we know when the learner is different when distress becomes involved, right? When distress in learning becomes involved. And we want to pay attention to that, especially early on, because I think as it goes undiagnosed, unhelped, it becomes part of the identity. And that's what you're talking about. Like that,
Yep.
That's the emotional piece I think you're talking about that has much longer term kind of consequences in many ways.
It becomes the student's identity, and it becomes who they are at school with their peers as well. Yeah. And unfortunately, they get labeled, I have a client who, or the child of a client who, during the pandemic, when everything became, now all of a sudden we're on a screen. So you're not in real-time learning, and the amount of reading and writing demands increased, similar to when you go and take an online class in college, right? Everything is responding to conversations, and that's spelling, that's writing, right? It's not, you can't talk with your peers, which tends to come more easily for kids who have that strength, the verbal strength. And there are brilliant children that have the verbal ability of an adult, yet they, really struggle to get that out on paper. But, one particular fourth grader that I'm thinking of, had everybody believing that her behavior was why she wasn't learning to read or spell. And this poor girl, when she finally got to the right place, she completely changed. They catch her reading during recess. I got a picture of her with a book, holding a book over her face, reading. That is not who this little girl was. She was miserable, and she was deemed a problem child with a behavior aid to essentially, protect everyone else from her meltdowns. Had they actually properly educated her, we would have never got there. And I want to circle back around to the little trauma, using my own son as an example. As a parent, I'm blessed to have, because of what I do, been able to say, and fortunate enough to be able to pay for outside intervention because it's very expensive. My hope is also to make this early intervention accessible, just like ABA is through insurance. We really need an overhaul because, kids, we need to start early. And that being said, and I have shared with my son my experience, they listen to me read children's books at night to them. And lately it's, can daddy read? And I'm like, of course. And they're like, because you have that thing, that dyslexia. I'm like, yes, dyslexia. And so I'm very open because I want them to know that it doesn't define me. But children's books, for some reason, just trip me up. And so, even young, even in the intervention that Leo's getting, even being exempt from writing what they're writing that was at his former preschool, I would just say, we're going to handle the reading and writing. Just, let him focus on math for now at school, because they unfortunately don't teach him the way he needs to learn. And he came home the other day and fell apart and said that somebody had asked him, they took the letter B and flipped it upside down and said, what is this letter now? Well, in the sequence of how he's learning how to read following the Orton-Gillingham method, they hadn't got to the letter P yet. So, and P, D, B, our worst nightmare. Just, if we could just get rid of that letter, I'd be really happy. He started sobbing in embarrassment. And he kept it together in speech. When I reached out and said, hey, what happened today? They said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. He played it off so smoothly, like it was no big deal in the speech room. And then when he came home and said how embarrassed he was that he didn't know the letter, of course, then I started crying, and it was a whole thing because I was living his experience and I was sharing with him in that moment. I feel how you feel. I know how it feels, and you're going to be okay because you got me in your court. I will be there for you no matter what. And it's okay to be in pain, and we're going to work through it. And yes, I know how it feels to be embarrassed. But even though I'm providing those supports for him, it's still feedback that obviously as a mama bear, I want to protect him and shelter him from all of that. But it's inevitable that we have to teach him to take in feedback that is supportive to him and leave everything else, outside of his psyche, because it's not going to be helpful for him to take in any type of criticism that he perceives or anything like that. So that was one incident. My hope, and my husband, who is not dyslexic, has really said, what's your end goal here with doing this early intervention for Leo and fighting for that with your clients? And I really, my end goal is to give him the reading instruction that his brain needs to learn how to read, write, and spell, while also nurturing him, educating him, and teaching him that just because he might have to work harder in this area, it doesn't define who he is. And that's something that's ongoing. That is that emotional support that I hope to not, have this trauma, like I said before, become so big that that's who he is as his identity. If I can get in front of it, who knows? I know that's a really big ask of the universe to all, work in my favor for this, but as much as I can to support him, because, I know that teachers all the time make mistakes when they are supporting kids with dyslexia, and they genuinely believe they're doing the right thing, genuinely. And I see it over and over and over in IEP after IEP after IEP after IEP. And that would be a whole nother part 2, part 3, part 4 of us talking of how teachers can interact with these students to not by accident cause harm, because I see it happening constantly. So we need to rally and get everyone together and on the same page about what these kids need. And I'll do it. I mean, I might end up old, really old by the time this makes a difference, but we have to. We have no other choice, right? I mean, even with this, I thought, I don't have a choice. I can't just send my child to kindergarten getting Fontes and Pinnell. That's the reading or the reading curriculum that the districts around here use, because he won't learn that way. Yeah. So it's
you know what I mean, I this goes back to, in regards to like advocacy, which is your profession. I mean, you are a professional advocate, an educator, but advocate. You got to know yourself. You have to know your client, your kiddo, that position of knowing who you are, having a lot of self-knowledge, and really accepting that as who you are. And I feel like for children, and we know this psychologically, that when kids are getting feedback they can't resolve, so they're getting information about themselves that they can't resolve about where that's from, then the only place they can go is to blame themselves for something. And so that's where like I'm stupid or lazy or unmotivated or these types of like moral diagnoses come in, right? So the ability for us to be paying attention, to be educated, I would agree with you. I see good intentions all over the place. In our work, in our line of work, there are good intentions everywhere. And it's the ability to maybe create those conversations and environments in which we can have conversations that say, can we question this? Because this isn't working, or how do we really meet someone's needs? And that's a very nuanced conversation that I don't see to happen all the time. And that's why, an advocate or is really helpful, actually, because parents are overwhelmed. Like, not only am I trying to figure out what's happening with my kiddo from a learning perspective because there's distress, but I don't know that bureaucratic system of what is the difference between a 504 SST and IEP. I mean, we could do a whole separate, conversation about that. But what I appreciate, though, Eryn, is what you're bringing to light here is the importance to look at dyslexia in a greater or bigger, more comprehensive way, to really include emotional processing and emotional identification, and how over time, when dyslexia isn't supported appropriately, it wreaks havoc on the identity of the person. So, that says a lot in regards to how we then launch our young people into the world. And, if you were to say to me, Gwen, I'm stupid, I'd be like, are you crazy, Eryn? No, and coming from a psychologist is probably not the greatest thing to say, but I mean, knowing you and how bright you are and how passionate you are and what you've done in the field, it's like, it's the farthest thing from the truth. And so, but to have that because of your lived experiences is what you're really fighting for. You're really coming at it from a very personal place, not only for yourself, but as an advocate now for your child. And you're very passionate about the clients that you serve. I mean, I've worked with you on many cases with this. And so, Eryn, if someone's listening to this and they're curious, they're like, oh, that's what's happening, or I think I need some extra help here, and they want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I would suggest going to our website. It's advocate2educate.com. And then we have a free 20-minute consultation. If you are an educator yourself or someone else in the field, you're not a parent, please still fill that information out. You can just put, NA where it's not applicable, but just go right through our website, and then we will respond to you via email, and we'll figure out a time for us to connect. And I love networking. I always want to talk about how we can better our community. One lasting kind of takeaway I would want to share is that there is science and research and books about dyslexia. So if you are an educator listening, I think one of my biggest frustrations is that in teacher credentialing school, I have a mild, moderate teaching credential. Essentially, I should be credentialed and be able to teach spelling and reading, which is so funny to me. Thank God I was never in that position. But, technically, I can. And that's, okay, they never taught me how to use the Orton-Gillingham method, but okay, another time. If you are a teacher listening, please use the internet and research and Google. And for the sake of the families going through this, going to an IEP and hearing, I've never had a dyslexic student in my class is impossible. It's 20% right now of the population. Dyslexia doesn't show up in some communities and not other communities. It's everywhere. So when we hear teachers saying, I've never had a dyslexic student, it's just not accurate. They've never been identified and somehow they've slipped through the cracks. Please educate yourself. And even if you don't learn the Orton-Gillingham method, that's okay. Just learn the signs that you should be looking for. And that will allow the parents to feel like, oh, at least you're aware that this exists, because we are still in a place of denial. And, there are some advocates that will come in very heavy and very angry that everybody doesn't know what dyslexia is and the treatment of dyslexia. And what I try to do is go in, and if they don't know, hold my tongue and just say, I'm happy to share information with you so that you can, get familiar with what we're talking about. It's so easy to Google, and the information's accurate. It's not like you're Googling information and you're getting conspiracy theories and all that. It's pretty straightforward. And I beg of teachers, educators, administrators, principals, learn the basics so that when you're in an IEP or an SST meeting and a parent is concerned, you are, I want to say, more elevated, and you're in the new conversation of, yes, I know what this is, and let's work together to try to come to a resolution, because parents are suffering when their kids are suffering. I heard once that parents are only as happy as their least happy child. And I remember that because the emotional toll on families and parents that are going through this are just, it's a huge problem right now. So educate yourself. Again, you don't have to be, this is not about perfection at all. Like, coming from me, if somebody saw how my spelling looked before spell check, they would go, well, that's interesting, right? Okay. But it doesn't matter. It's just about continuing to grow and learn and become sensitive to this whole topic, because it can be really, really traumatizing.
Thank you, Eryn. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being vulnerable, sharing not only your experience, but your experience as a mother. So I just really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
You're welcome so much.